The lab reeked of chemicals and tension when Troy's hand shot forward, clamping hard around Kira's throat and forcing her back against the cold metal table. Glassware rattled, her pulse thundered. But beneath the pressure, her mind was calm, measured, every breath calculating distance, leverage, and the split-second opening she needed. This was no longer a classroom dispute. This was the moment Kira would decide who controlled the next move. The final bell of the day had long since faded into silence. The corridors of Ridgeview High School lay in the half-light of late afternoon, their usual rush of footsteps replaced by the low hum of air vents. Inside the chemistry lab, Kira Holt moved with measured precision. Each beaker, flask, and pipette found its rightful place in the cabinet, each countertop wiped clean with the same care she once applied to the maintenance of field equipment overseas. The air smelled faintly of ethanol and chalk dust, a scent she had come to associate with the end of a school day. Outside the windows, the Georgia sky had turned the color of cooling steel. In this quiet hour, the lab was her sanctuary, a place where knowledge and discipline held sway over chaos. She exhaled slowly, the calm rhythm of her movements, a silent counterpoint to the storms she sometimes faced within these walls. Then the door slammed shut. It was not the casual click of a latch falling into place. It was a sharp, deliberate sound, the kind that announces not just an ending, but an intention. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, twice, then steadied, their pale glow cutting long shadows across the counters. Kira's hand froze above a glass jar of copper sulfate. 3 figures stood between her and the exit. In front, blocking the direct path to the door, was Troy Bennett. At 17, the quarterback of the school's football team carried the frame of a young man who had been told all his life that strength and size were enough to bend the world. 6'3", broad-shouldered, with hair the color of pale straw cropped close to his head, he wore his royal blue varsity jacket as if it were a coat of arms. The school's emblem gleamed on the white sleeves. His gaze locked onto Kira with a heat that spoke of something far deeper than adolescent mischief. To Troy's left lounged Kyle Dorsey, tall and narrow. His body moved like a hinge too loose to ever fully stand straight. A vivid green hoodie hung from his frame, the hood shadowing eyes that darted between Troy and Kira with restless energy. To the right stood Evan Pierce, thick-necked, broad-chested, his buzz-cut head tilted just enough to project quiet menace. The orange of his graphic T-shirt blazed unnaturally bright under the lab lights, like a warning flare. No one spoke at first. The silence drew tight around them, stretching thin enough that Kira could hear the soft hiss of the gas taps at the lab benches. Troy took a step forward, the rubber soles of his shoes whispering against the tile. His lips curved into a smirk that did not reach his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried easily in the stillness. "People like you do not belong here, Holt." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. They carried more than personal animosity. They carried history, the weight of every time someone had tried to diminish her place in a room by reducing her to the color of her skin and the sum of their prejudices. Kira's eyes narrowed, but her face remained composed. She placed the jar back onto the counter with care, her movements slow, deliberate, offering no fuel to the fire in Troy's posture. One hand found the cool edge of the lab table. Her fingers curled around it, feeling the familiar solidity beneath her touch, a fixed point in the shifting air. The overhead lights flickered again. For a moment, the room dipped into shadow, and in that half-second she saw the tableau clearly. 3 young men, in calculated positions, the exits blocked, the path behind her hemmed in by lab benches. "You will move," Kira said, her voice calm even, "and you will do it now." Troy's smirk widened into something colder. "You think a voice like that works here? This is not your army. Nobody follows your orders." Kyle shifted his weight against the doorframe, arms crossed, his grin a pale imitation of Troy's confidence. Evan did not move at all, his stillness more unsettling than aggression. Kira straightened, letting the silence stretch again. In another life, In another uniform, she had stood before men twice Troy's size and commanded them to hold the line under fire. Here, the battlefield was smaller, quieter, but no less dangerous. Troy's eyes locked with hers. In that gaze, arrogance met resolve. His breathing slowed, shoulders settling into the stance of someone about to act. Her thumb traced the edge of the counter. The muscle memory of countless drills ran like a quiet current beneath her skin. She knew the distance between them to the inch, knew exactly how far his arm could reach before she needed to move. Then Troy closed the last of that distance. With a suddenness that broke the tension like shattering glass, his hand shot out. Fingers hooked into the collar of her blouse, fabric tightening against her throat. His knuckles brushed her jaw as the force of the grab pulled her half a step forward. The breath between them was close, charged with intent. And in the flicker of the lights, the moment hung, Troy's grip set, Kira's body poised, every muscle alive with the choice she would make next. The summer sun hung low over Ridgeview County, stretching the shadows of oak trees across the narrow main street. Kira Holt stepped out of her car and onto the sidewalk, the heat rising from the pavement, wrapping around her like a second skin. The sign above the entrance to Ridgeview High School gleamed with fresh paint, deep blue letters against a white background, the school's eagle mascot poised mid-flight. Her first day was not meant to begin with ceremony. She preferred quiet arrivals, to learn the rhythm of a place before anyone noticed her presence. Yet as she crossed the parking lot, she could feel the eyes, passing glances from clusters of students and a few faculty members standing near the doors. She recognized that look. It was not unkind, but it held the careful curiosity of people taking measure of someone who did not match the usual pattern of their days. In Ridgeview, where most faces were pale under the southern sun, hers stood out. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of floor polish and paper. Trophy cases lined the walls, gold and silver cups, framed photographs of grinning teams in matching uniforms. Football trophies occupied the largest case, their brass plates engraved with the Bennett name in bold letters. Kira's gaze lingered on one photo. Troy Bennett, helmet under his arm, smiling with the unchallenged confidence of someone born into victory. She found her way to the chemistry lab, a rectangular room with windows overlooking the football field. The counters were sturdy but worn, the black tops scratched from years of experiments. She began unpacking boxes, setting out glassware, labeling supplies. There was a certain peace in arranging a workspace, everything in its place, ready for action. The peace was interrupted by a light tap on the doorframe. A girl stood there, clutching a folder to her chest. She was small, with dark hair pulled into a braid that fell over her shoulder, her eyes bright but cautious. "Are you Miss Holt?" the girl asked. "Yes. And you are?" "Maria Lopez. I was hoping to talk to you. About something." She hesitated, then stepped inside, lowering her voice. "It is about Troy Bennett." Kira paused, the name already familiar from the trophy case. "Go on." Maria's fingers tightened around the folder. "I was working on my project for the science fair. It was almost finished. I stayed late one afternoon to check the results, and when I came back the next morning, everything was ruined. Chemicals spilled, glass broken. I know it was him." He laughed about it in the cafeteria. Kira felt the heat rise at the back of her neck. She knew that kind of cruelty, casual, calculated, and entirely confident it would go unpunished. "Did you report it?" Maria shook her head. "No one listens. He is the mayor's son, the last teacher who tried to stand up to him." She left before the semester ended. Kira's mind was already sorting the facts, the way it had in the field when reports came in over the radio. She reached into her desk and pulled out a slim notebook, its black cover worn from years of use. On the first clean page, she wrote the date, Maria's name, and a brief summary of what she had just heard. "I listen," Kira said quietly, "and I write things down." Over the next weeks, she filled that notebook with neat, precise entries. Times, dates, details. Troy's late arrivals, his loud interruptions, the subtle shoves in crowded hallways, the way certain students would flinch when he walked past. She never confronted him without cause. But she watched. Always, she watched. The first real clash came during an afternoon lab session. The room was warm, the air heavy with the sharp tang of hydrochloric acid, as students worked in pairs. Kira moved between tables, checking measurements, correcting posture with gentle but firm guidance. Troy entered 15 minutes late, his jacket slung over one shoulder. He moved through the room with deliberate slowness, his gaze sweeping over the class before settling on the far counter where Maria was working. Kira intercepted him. "You are late, Mr. Bennett," she said evenly. "Take your seat and catch up with the assignment." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. As he passed her, his shoulder clipped hers, not an accident, not with the controlled weight behind it. The impact drove her a half-step sideways into the edge of a counter. A graduated cylinder teetered, then fell, shattering on the floor and sending a spray of diluted acid across the tiles. "Back from the benches," Kira ordered, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. She reached for the neutralizing powder, her movements swift, practiced. Within seconds, the spill was under control, the broken glass safely swept away. When she looked up, Troy was leaning against the far counter, watching her with a lazy confidence, as if daring her to make it more than what it appeared to be. "Accidents happen," he said, the words shaped to sound harmless. Kira's gaze held his for a moment longer than necessary. She knew better than to argue in front of an audience that might later twist her words. Instead, she noted the incident in her book, the ink strokes steady and dark. The day ended with the usual flurry of lockers slamming and voices fading into the distance. Kira stayed behind, the last of the sunlight catching on the glassware as she set it in order. The quiet of the room settled around her once more. She opened her desk drawer to store her notebook. That was when she saw it. A folded piece of paper lay across the top of her folders, the edges slightly crumpled as if it had been shoved in hastily. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers steady even as her stomach tightened. The message was written in block letters, thick and uneven. "Go back to where you came from." For a moment, the lab seemed to grow colder. She read the words again, not because she doubted their meaning, but because she understood them too well. The ink on the page was just another weapon, aimed not at her competence but at her very right to stand in this room. Kira folded the note carefully and slid it between the pages of her notebook. The act was deliberate, almost ritual, evidence, documentation. She would not forget, and she would not look away. Outside, the last of the daylight slipped behind the bleachers of the football field, and the empty hallway carried the distant echo of a door closing somewhere deep in the school. The battle lines had been drawn. The morning after she found the note, Kira arrived at Ridgeview High School earlier than usual. The sun was barely above the tree line, its light pale against the heavy clouds gathering in the east. She carried her briefcase in one hand and, in the other, the slim black notebook that now held the folded piece of paper. Its weight felt greater than paper should allow. The hallways were still and cool. She turned left at the main office and headed toward the security resource officer's room. The door was half open, and inside, Officer Leon Brooks was pouring coffee into a paper cup. "Kira Holt," he said, his voice warming with recognition. "It has been too long." She stepped in and closed the door behind her. "It is good to see you, Leon." Her tone was measured, but her eyes told him she had not come for a social visit. They had served together in the army, 2 deployments, one in Afghanistan, one in Iraq. Brooks had been a steady presence then, a man whose calm could anchor a unit under fire. Now, in the uniform of a local police officer, he looked older, but the steadiness remained. She placed the notebook on his desk and opened it to the page, holding the folded note. "I found this in my desk drawer yesterday. After what Maria told me, after everything I have seen, I thought it was time you knew." Brooks read the words slowly, then laid the paper flat on the desk. His jaw tightened. "This is not just schoolyard trouble, Kira. You know whose son you are dealing with." "I know," she said. "That is why I am here." He leaned back in his chair. "The Bennetts have deep roots in this county. Richard Bennett has been mayor for 3 terms. They know every board member, every administrator. If you push this, it will not be a clean fight. They will protect their own, and they will come after you in ways you cannot anticipate." Kira met his gaze without flinching. "I have dealt with enemies who had more power than the Bennetts. I am not interested in intimidation, Leon. I am interested in the truth." Brooks sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Then do it by the book. Document everything. Do not give them a single reason to claim you acted outside the rules. And be ready for this to get ugly. I have been ready since I saw Maria's face when she told me what he did." By the end of first period, Kira had typed up a formal incident report. It included the note, Maria's account of her ruined project, the chemical spill incident, and other smaller disruptions she had documented. She attached photographs of the note, signed and dated each page, and scanned them for her own records. At noon, she carried the file to Principal Janet Holloway's office. Holloway was a tall woman in her early 50s with carefully styled hair and the guarded expression of someone accustomed to balancing politics and policy. She gestured for Kira to sit. "What can I do for you, Miss Holt?" Kira placed the folder on the desk between them. "This is a record of repeated harassment, vandalism, and intimidation involving Troy Bennett. I am submitting it for disciplinary review." Holloway did not reach for the folder immediately. "Troy's record has always been complicated," she said carefully. "You understand that he is under a lot of pressure as the football team's quarterback. There is a lot riding on his performance this season." Kira's voice was steady. "There is more riding on the safety and dignity of this school's students and staff. Pressure does not excuse cruelty." Holloway's fingers tapped the edge of the folder. "Miss Holt, I have to be honest. Complaints about Troy tend to disappear at higher levels. The school board is protective, and his father has influence. That is why this will not stop here," Kira said. "I am filing copies of this report with the district office and with the teachers' union. If local administration will not act, there are other channels." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Holloway sighed and pulled the folder toward her. "Very well. I will add this to the record. Just be prepared for backlash." "I have been prepared for years," Kira replied, rising from her chair. The decision was a lock-in. There would be no turning back now. In the military, once a plan was set in motion past a certain point, there was no retreat, only execution. This was no different. That evening, after dinner at home, Kira sat at her desk in the small study she had arranged with books, framed photographs, and the quiet order that made her feel grounded. The rain had begun to fall outside, tapping against the window in a soft, steady rhythm. She opened her laptop to check the day's messages. At first, there was nothing unusual, emails from colleagues, reminders about grading deadlines. Then she saw it. The subject line was blank. She clicked it open. The message contained no words at first, only an attached image. She hesitated, then double-clicked the file. Her own family looked back at her from the screen. A photograph taken without their knowledge, her sister and 2 nephews walking down the steps of their church, sunlight on their faces. Below the image, a single line of text appeared. "You will be gone soon." The words were stark, impersonal, and chilling in their certainty. Kira felt the slow, cold spread of anger beneath her ribs. This was not just about her now. Someone had stepped beyond school walls and into her life. She closed the laptop gently, her movements controlled, but her mind was already in motion. The fight had come to her doorstep, and she would meet it head-on. The following week began with a tension Kira could almost measure in the air. It lingered in the way certain conversations hushed when she walked into the faculty lounge, in the guarded glances from students who had caught whispers of the report she had filed. In Ridgeview High School, news traveled fast. but truth traveled slower. By Wednesday, the autumn light had grown thinner, sliding through the lab's high windows in narrow bands. Kira was at her desk preparing the day's materials when the door opened, not with the smooth motion of someone respecting a classroom, but with the deliberate swing of someone making an entrance. Troy Bennett walked in 15 minutes past the start of the period. The royal blue of his varsity jacket looked almost electric under the fluorescent lights. He carried no books, no lab manual, only a smirk that deepened as the class turned to watch. "You are late again, mister?" "Bennett," Kira said, her tone even but edged with authority. "Please take your seat and prepare your station." He did not move toward his bench. Instead, he strolled between tables, glancing over shoulders, tapping the edge of a beaker here, brushing against a rack of test tubes there. Kira's gaze tracked him, cataloging each unnecessary movement. When he reached Maria Lopez's table, his hand shot out without warning. He gripped her lab folder and tugged it toward himself. Pages filled with careful handwriting and diagrams bent under his fingers. "Give that back," Maria said, her voice small but sharp. Troy grinned, holding the folder just out of her reach. "What is this? Advanced chemistry notes? Looks like too much work for one person." Kira was already moving. Her footsteps were silent on the tile, but her presence arrived like a change in air pressure. She positioned herself beside Troy, her posture calm, her voice low. "Release the folder, Mr. Bennett." He looked at her, his grin unchanged. "Or what?" The next motion happened in less than a second. Kira's left hand intercepted his wrist, her grip precise, fingers pressing into the tendons. She rotated his arm gently but firmly, applying a controlled wrist lock that shifted his weight and drew his focus entirely to the point of pressure. The technique was non-violent yet undeniable, enough to immobilize without causing harm, enough to remind him that size alone did not determine control. Troy's eyes flickered, surprise breaking through the mask of arrogance. "You are holding school property and interfering with another student's work," Kira said. Her voice was steady, almost quiet, but it carried to the back of the room. "Let go." He released the folder. Maria caught it with both hands and stepped back, her expression a mix of relief and disbelief. Kira loosened her grip on Troy's wrist and stepped away, her posture neutral once more. "Please return to your station," she said. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. Troy turned, walking slowly back to his bench. The tension in his shoulders was no longer the casual confidence of a boy untouchable in his own territory. It was something sharper, more calculating. What Kira did not see in that moment was the phone in the hands of a student near the back, the quick flick of a camera app, the silent capture of a few seconds of movement. By the time the lunch bell rang, that clip, a clear view of Troy Bennett having his wrist controlled by the new chemistry teacher, quote, was already moving through group chats. The video was short, no more than 10 seconds, but it carried the weight of humiliation in a school where image was currency. Students replayed it in hallways, their whispers stretching into chuckles, then into open laughter when Troy passed by. By the end of the day, the clip had been saved, shared, and renamed in ways that reduced it to a single, mocking headline. Kira heard about it from Maria, who lingered after class to thank her. "They are all talking about it," Maria said, her voice low. "Some of them think it is the best thing they have seen all year. Others—" she hesitated. "Others are saying he is going to make you pay for it." Kira smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. "Thank you for telling me. And thank you for keeping your focus today. That was not easy." After Maria left, Kira sat for a moment in the empty lab, the fading afternoon light painting long shadows across the counters. She knew Troy would not take the public sting quietly. Humiliation was a wound that could fester in someone who lived on power and perception. The sound of a knock broke her thoughts. It was Officer Leon Brooks, leaning in through the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but the crease between his brows was deeper than usual. "I thought you should know," he said. "The security camera covering the second-floor lab corridor went offline this afternoon. The system shows it was disabled manually." Kira straightened in her chair. When? About 20 minutes before your class started, Brooks replied. It could be nothing, but I doubt it. The quiet hum of the ventilation seemed louder suddenly, the sterile air heavier. Kira's mind moved quickly, connecting this new piece to everything already on the board. The note in her desk, the email with her family's photograph, the deliberate disruptions. If the cameras were down, someone wanted shadows where there should be light. And in those shadows, lines could be crossed. She closed her notebook slowly, the motion deliberate. Then we had better assume it is something. The video of the wrist lock had been circulating for 2 days when the first cracks began to show. Troy Bennett's usual stride through the locker room was measured and confident, but now his movements had a brittleness, like glass under pressure. The laughter of his teammates trailed after him, not loud enough to be called open mockery, but sharpened at the edges. It was the kind of laughter that clung to a person, repeating in their mind long after the sound faded. He tried to ignore it as he dropped his gym bag onto the bench. Someone near the far end of the room whispered, and another chuckled. Troy caught a glimpse of the phone in one player's hand, the screen showing a frozen frame of him in Kira Holt's grasp. "Hey, Bennett," a voice called from across the room, dripping with false innocence. "Need a hand with that jacket? Or should we ask Miss Holt?" The room erupted in short, sharp bursts of amusement. Troy's jaw tightened. He forced a smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "Laugh while you can," he muttered under his breath. Loud enough for those closest to hear. That afternoon, the sound of cleats against pavement followed him out of the athletic wing. Kyle Dorsey and Evan Pierce fell into step on either side of him, their voices low but urgent. "They think you are soft now," Kyle said, shoving his hands into the pockets of his vivid green hoodie. "Let her get away with that, and they will never stop." Evan's expression was more calculating, the tilt of his head suggesting a plan already forming. "We could fix this. After hours, no witnesses." Troy did not answer right away. His pride was a living thing, raw and restless, pacing behind his ribs. Every replay of that video was another twist of the knife. "What do you have in mind?" he asked finally. "Something simple," Evan said. "A reminder of who runs this place. Nothing that leaves a mark, just enough to make her think twice before trying something like that again." Kyle grinned, but there was no humor in it. "Or maybe we make it personal. She likes protecting that little Maria, right?" Troy's gaze flicked toward the science wing, where the late afternoon light slanted through the high windows. He did not commit, but he did not walk away either. Maria was in the lab well past the last bell, hunched over her workstation. Her science fair project sat in careful pieces. Rows of small containers, each labeled, each part of a sequence she had been building for weeks. The smell of the chemicals was faint but distinct, a mixture she had come to associate with the quiet satisfaction of progress. She was recalibrating a set of measurements when she noticed it, a fine dusting of powder across the counter that she had not left there. The smallest of her glass containers lay on its side, its contents pooling into the groove where the countertop met the wall. Her chest tightened. She looked closer. The reagents she had spent hours preparing were ruined, mixed carelessly, their colors dulled into a muddy gray. The careful notes she had kept were wet along one edge, the ink bleeding into unreadable smears. Maria's first instinct was disbelief, the mind's refusal to accept that someone would sabotage the same project twice. Then came the familiar wash of helpless anger. She stood there for a long moment, hands gripping the edge of the table, until the feeling solidified into something colder. She knew who had done this, and she knew she could not fix it alone. Kira was finishing her grading when Maria appeared at the doorway. The girl's braid was looser than usual, strands of hair falling against her face. "It happened again," Maria said simply. Kira set down her pen. "Show me." In the lab, the damage was unmistakable. The smell alone told Kira the reagents had been tampered with. She examined the mess without touching it, her mind recording every detail. The angle of the overturned container, the smudged footprints near the edge of the counter, the faint trace of something gritty on the floor tiles. "Do you have a backup of your data?" Kira asked. Maria nodded reluctantly. "On my laptop at home. But this sets me back weeks." Kira placed a hand lightly on the girl's shoulder. "We will make sure this is part of the record, and we will not let them erase it." And fit. As Maria left, Kira pulled out her black notebook and began writing. The act steadied her breathing, gave structure to the surge of anger tightening in her chest. Each entry was a wall in the case she was building, a structure she intended to make unshakable. The sound of her phone cut through the quiet. She glanced at the screen. "Officer Brooks! Kira!" His voice came, low and deliberate. "You need to know, the entire security system in the science wing went offline about an hour ago. Not just the hallway camera this time, all of them." The pen in Kira's hand stilled. "How long will it be down? They are saying it is a technical fault, but the timing is too precise. It will be at least until tomorrow before they can bring it back online." She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing the darkened feed monitors, the blind spots opening like doorways. "Be careful," Brooks added. "If someone wanted privacy, they just got it." "Oh." Kira opened her eyes, the quiet resolve in them hardening to steel. "Then I will keep the lights on in here myself." The memory of the wrist lock, of Maria's ruined project, the email with her family's photograph, all of it sharpened into a single point in Kira Holt's mind as the lab doors slammed and Troy Bennett's shadow fell across her. We were back where it began. The fluorescent lights trembled in their sockets, casting cold, pale halos over the counters. The smell of glass cleaner and chemical residue hung in the air, a faint echo of earlier experiments. Kira's left hand rested on the smooth edge of the lab table. Her right stayed loose at her side, ready. Troy's approach was silent at first, his broad frame absorbing the light, until he stood close enough for her to see the pale tension in his jaw. His hand shot forward, gripping her collar with a suddenness that stole the breath from her throat. In one fluid motion, he drove her back until her lower spine pressed against the unyielding lip of the table. The steel of the table edge cut into her. His knuckles were hard beneath the fabric at her neck, his breath hot with the force of his words. "You think you can embarrass me and get away with it?" The world narrowed to the pressure on her collarbone, the heat of his weight, the deliberate blocking of every exit. Kyle Dorsey leaned against the closed door, his lanky frame spread wide to fill the space, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Evan Pierce stood at the far right, his buzz-cut head tilted, eyes watchful. Kira's heartbeat slowed, not sped up. It was the same stillness that had come to her in distant deserts when the sound of gunfire rolled too close. In that space, there was no panic, only calculation. Her right thumb brushed against the small control on her phone in her pocket. She had activated the voice recording function the moment she stepped out of Officer Brooks's office earlier that afternoon. She knew better than to trust memory alone. "Let go, Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice low but steady. He leaned closer, his grip tightening. "Make me." In that instant, Kira moved. Her left foot pivoted outward, her torso turning with practiced precision. She brought her right arm up, guiding his over her shoulder and down in a controlled arc. The motion shifted his balance without tearing muscle or striking bone. His wrist rotated under her hand, caught in a joint lock that transferred the control from his size to her leverage. It was not a blow, not a throw, just a simple redirection, the way water moves around rock until the rock shifts. Troy grunted, the sudden loss of dominance flashing across his face. Kira released him the moment his grip slackened, stepping back to create space between them. Her stance was neutral, but the energy in her posture said clearly, "There will be no second chance to take me by surprise." Kyle's smirk faltered. Evan's eyes flickered from Troy to Kira and back, gauging something he had not expected to see. "Step aside," Kira said to Troy, her tone as even as if she were instructing him to measure a reagent. But humiliation is a powerful fuel, and Troy had already tasted more of it than his pride could bear. He straightened, his chest rising and falling with the force of his breath. "She is not walking out of here," Kyle said from the door, his voice a low provocation. Troy's eyes narrowed. "Number." "Not yet." He lunged. Kira shifted her weight back, her right hand coming up, ready to redirect again, this time prepared for more force. The air in the room thickened with intent, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like the faint whine before a storm breaks. Behind Troy, Kyle moved to block the door entirely, his shoulders pressing against the frame. Evan stepped sideways, cutting off the narrow gap between the last lab bench and the counter. Kira could feel the precise geometry of the trap, the calculated placement, the narrowed options. Her mind ticked off distances, angles, exits. Then, beneath the thrum of the lights and the scrape of Troy's shoes against the tile, came a new sound. Footsteps. Slow, measured, growing louder in the hallway outside. Troy did not seem to hear them yet. Kyle's gaze flickered toward the door. Just for a moment. Kira kept her eyes on Troy, but inside she felt the shift, a widening of possibility in the space that had been closing in. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door, and in that breath, before whatever came next, the lab was utterly still. Troy's second lunge met with nothing but empty air. Kira pivoted just enough to let his momentum pass her, her eyes locked on his with a steadiness that refused to yield. The momentary slip threw him off balance, and in that breath of imbalance, the silence inside the lab thickened. It was the kind of silence that vibrated, taut as a wire ready to snap at the smallest disturbance. Kira felt every detail, her pulse steady and deliberate, the faint tremor in the humming lights overhead, the placement of Kyle at the door, his lanky frame still blocking escape, Evan's broader silhouette leaning against the counter, watchful. She took in Troy's posture, shoulders squared, fists clenched, the quick flare of his nostrils. He was still deciding whether to strike again, but his ego would not allow him to step back. She drew in a slow, deliberate breath. When she spoke, her voice cut through the tension with the precision of a blade. "Troy Alexander Bennett." She said his full name with deliberate clarity, placing each syllable in the air, as if it were already part of a sworn statement. The sound of it changed the atmosphere. It was no longer the banter of a classroom spat. It was legal. It was official. "You are, at this very moment, committing assault and battery on a school employee, criminal intimidation, and attempted coercion," she continued. The words stopped him for a fraction of a second, his arrogance momentarily jarred by the formality and certainty in her tone. His jaw tightened, a flash of recognition passing over his eyes, recognition that she knew exactly what she was talking about. She turned her gaze on the others, her voice still even but harder now, edged with steel. "Your associates, Kyle Dorsey and Evan Pierce, are present as active participants in this incident. By preventing my exit, you have made yourselves accessories to these crimes. That means you will answer for them alongside him." Kyle's smirk faltered, the false bravado slipping like a poorly fastened mask. His eyes darted sideways toward Evan. Evan's weight shifted from one foot to the other, his folded arms loosening, the calculated posture of intimidation beginning to dissolve. This was not the version of events they had pictured, where the teacher would be rattled, cornered, struggling for words. "You think you can scare me with big words?" Troy's voice rose, sharpened by the sting of his wounded pride. He leaned forward, lowering his tone to something darker, more deliberate. "Women like you should remember their place." The phrase struck, but not as he intended. Kira felt it, yes, but the sensation was not humiliation. It was the familiar, tempered heat of recognition. She had heard variations of that sentence in distant war zones, in meetings with superiors who doubted her authority, and from strangers who underestimated her the moment she stepped into a room. Those words were the anthem of those clinging to ground they feared losing. Her gaze did not waver. She stepped forward, closing the space between them by a single measured pace, not enough to provoke, but enough to assert that she was not retreating. "You want to talk about place, Mr. Bennett?" Then let us talk about where your place will be when this is over." Her tone was calm, almost conversational, but the weight in her words pressed down like stone. "At 17 years of age, you are old enough to be charged as an adult. Assault on a school employee is a felony in this state. Add to that criminal intimidation, attempted coercion, and the fact that this building has security cameras most of the time, and you are looking at a permanent criminal record. Every background check you face will bring this moment back into view. Your college applications will be flagged. The scholarship offers you boast about will vanish, and the scouts who once called your name will stop calling altogether." She let the silence stretch for a beat, watching the calculation flicker behind his eyes. "Your father will be questioned. His political opponents will seize this and dismantle his career piece by piece. While you are explaining to a judge why you threw away your future for the thrill of trying to frighten your chemistry teacher, I will still be here, teaching the next class." The words settled like an unwelcome shadow, filling the space around them. Kyle swallowed audibly, the movement of his throat breaking the stillness. His stance shifted, his weight no longer braced like a barrier. Evan's arms dropped completely to his sides, his eyes flicking toward the door as though gauging whether it was time to cut their losses. But Troy's pride resisted. His mouth opened, ready to spit another word of defiance. Then a sound rose beyond the door, sharp and unmistakable, the wail of a police siren. It began faint, somewhere in the distance, then swelled quickly, echoing down the corridor outside. The pitch rose and fell in short bursts, each one closer, until it cut off with a suddenness that left the air vibrating in its absence. In the quiet that followed came a new sound, the measured, rhythmic stamp of boots on tile. For the first time, Troy's eyes shifted, not toward Kira, but toward the door. His stance, once anchored in arrogance, bent under the weight of the approaching reality. Kyle's shoulder brushed against the door frame as he stepped back slightly, his earlier certainty leaking away in small, involuntary movements. Evan's gaze flickered toward the handle, his posture no longer one of defiance but of bracing for impact. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, and unhurried, each one echoing in the enclosed space of the lab's entrance hall. Kira kept her eyes on Troy, not granting him the satisfaction of watching her react to the approaching presence. The handle turned, and then Officer Leon Brooks stepped into the doorway. His presence filled the room before he said a word. His uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp, the badge catching the sterile light. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes swept the scene in one efficient pass. Kira standing firm by the lab table, Troy still too close. Kyle shifted half out of the doorway. Evan caught mid-step away from the counter. The air inside the lab changed, the shift so tangible it was as if a new weather front had moved in. And in that moment, before anyone could speak, every person in the room knew the balance of control had shifted. Officer Leon Brooks stepped fully into the lab, his gaze settling on Troy Bennett first, then sweeping to Kyle Dorsey and Evan Pierce. The air shifted as if an invisible curtain had fallen, dividing what had just happened from what would follow. Brooks's voice was steady, professional, but it carried an edge that cut through the tension. "Everyone here will come with me to the principal's office. Now, Troy tried to speak, but Brooks raised a hand, the kind of small, unhurried motion that said there would be no debate. Kyle pushed himself off the doorframe, his long limbs suddenly awkward, while Evan straightened from the counter, his eyes fixed on the floor. Kira moved last, her steps controlled, each one grounded in a discipline that masked the churn beneath her calm exterior. She knew this was far from over. The corridor outside was hushed, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Their footsteps echoed in the stillness as Brooks led them down the hall, past rows of lockers and the wide-eyed stares of students lingering at classroom doors. By the time they reached Principal Janet Holloway's office, the administrative assistant had already risen from her desk, sensing the current that entered with them. Holloway appeared in the doorway to her inner office, her expression pinched, her gaze flicking from Brooks to Kira to the boys. Inside, The principal's office was neat, almost austere, a mahogany desk, a pair of visitor chairs, and framed photographs of student achievements on the wall. The football team appeared more than once, their trophies gleaming under spotlights. Brooks closed the door behind them and began without ceremony. "We need to record a statement regarding an incident in the chemistry lab involving Miss Holt and these 3 students." Holloway hesitated, her hand hovering near the edge of her desk. "What exactly happened?" Brooks's tone left no room for misunderstanding. "Assault, criminal intimidation, and interference with a staff member performing her duties. I witnessed the tail end of it myself." Kira stood silent as Brooks described what he had seen, his report clinical, precise. When he finished, he placed a printed incident form on the desk and slid it toward Holloway. "I will need your signature to confirm administrative receipt. All present will also sign as witnesses to their own involvement or presence." Troy's jaw was tight, his hand unmoving as the pen was placed in front of him. Kyle and Evans signed without looking up, their names sharp and slanted across the paper. Kira added hers last, her handwriting steady, unhurried. Holloway set the signed form aside, her fingers drumming lightly on the wood. "I will have to call your parents," she told the boys. Her eyes landed on Troy. "Including your father." "Oh." At that, something flickered across Troy's face, not fear exactly, but an awareness of the conversation that would soon unfold at home. The calls went quickly. Kyle's and Evan's parents were terse but cooperative. When Holloway dialed the Bennett's number, the atmosphere in the room shifted again. She stepped into the adjoining conference space to speak privately, but her voice carried, lowered, firm at first, then softening. Through the partially closed door, Kira caught fragments. "Yes, I understand. Of course, Mayor Bennett, this is not my decision alone." When Holloway returned, her composure was intact, but her shoulders were set in the way of someone balancing 2 impossible weights. "Mr. Bennett, you are suspended for 1 week. You are prohibited from contacting Miss Holt or Maria Lopez during this time. This applies both on and off school grounds." The words were crisp, but Kira could hear the reluctance under them. This was not a decision made with conviction. It was a decision squeezed into existence by the undeniable presence of Brooks and the signed statements. Kira said nothing, though inside she noted the principal's choice of language. A week, no mention of what would happen next, no assurance that the report would remain on record. When the others filed out, she lingered just long enough to thank Brooks. He caught her eye and gave the barest nod, a silent confirmation that he understood the stakes. Back in her classroom, Kira slipped her phone from her pocket. The recording app was still running. She stopped it, saved the file, and transferred a copy to an encrypted drive. The chain of custody mattered, especially in a place where files could vanish without explanation. She knew that the moment she stopped guarding this evidence, it might disappear. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to fade, the hallways emptying into the stillness of after hours. She heard the sound before she saw him, measured footsteps, unhurried, but deliberate. Troy Bennett passed the open doorway to her lab, then stopped. He turned his head just enough to meet her eyes. The look he gave her was neither rage nor open threat. It was colder than that, a promise shaped in silence. Kira met his gaze without blinking. He was telling her that a week would not be the end, and she was telling him, without a word, that she knew. The rumors began quietly, like hairline cracks spreading through glass. By the end of the week, they were everywhere. It started with murmurs in the hallways, students whispering that Miss Holt had attacked a player on the football team. Then came the embellished retellings, warped with each repetition. She had thrown him against a wall. She had twisted his arm until he cried out. She had humiliated him in front of the entire class. None of it mentioned the grip on her collar, the blocked exit, or the recording stored in her files. By Monday, the story had migrated beyond the school walls. An email landed in the inboxes of dozens of parents. It was unsigned, but its words were calculated, A teacher with a violent history is endangering our children. How long will we allow this in Ridgeview High School? Attached was a still image, cropped from the hallway video, Kira's hand on Troy's wrist, frozen midlock, stripped of context. In the teacher's lounge, conversations stopped when she entered. Some colleagues offered her brief nods, their eyes cautious, as though acknowledging her might pull them into the storm. Others avoided her gaze entirely. Then the calls began. The principal's office phone rang with complaints, most from parents she had never met. A small but vocal group demanded that the district remove her for the safety of the students. Kira knew the phrasing. She had seen it used before to dress prejudice in the language of concern. 2 days later, she was summoned to Principal Holloway's office. "I am placing you on temporary leave, Miss Holt," Holloway said, her voice tight, "until the school board hearing next week. The Bennetts are pressing for a full review of your conduct." Kira sat still, her hands folded in her lap. She heard the words, but beneath them she could hear the machinery moving, the pressure from the mayor's office, the fear of public image, the calculation of what was easier to silence. "Understood," she said. The following week passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. Without the structure of her classes, the days stretched long. She spent the time preparing, organizing her documentation, printing transcripts of her audio files, ensuring her evidence was backed up in 3 separate places. At night, she thought of Maria, of the look in the girl's eyes when she saw her project destroyed for the second time. The morning of the hearing, the sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Kira walked into the district building wearing the same calm expression she had worn into briefings before difficult missions. Inside the boardroom, rows of folding chairs were filled with parents, teachers, and students. At the front, the long table of the school board gleamed under fluorescent light. The Bennetts were already there. Richard Bennett sat beside his wife, his posture radiating confidence. Troy sat between them, wearing a suit that did not quite fit, his expression carefully arranged into something between innocence and injured pride. When the proceedings began, the board chair outlined the allegations: excessive force, unprofessional conduct, creating an unsafe learning environment. The words sounded clinical, but Kira could feel the weight they carried in the minds of those who did not know the truth. The Bennett's attorney spoke first. He painted a picture of a teacher who overreacted to a minor classroom disagreement, who allowed personal bias to color her treatment of a student. Each sentence was polished, designed to erode her credibility. When it was Kira's turn, she rose slowly, her evidence binder in hand. She spoke without raising her voice, detailing the events from her first day at Ridgeview to the confrontation in the lab. She described the note in her desk, the chemical spill, the destruction of Maria's project. She outlined the sequence of the assault, careful to use precise, factual language. The district's counsel leaned forward, flipping through the binder. "Do you have visual evidence of the incident?" he asked. "Yes," Kira said. "But not every angle. One hallway camera was offline. My primary record is audio, captured in real time." The counsel's expression was unreadable. "We will need something corroborating the moments leading up to the recording." From the corner of her vision, Kira saw Richard Bennett's mouth curve into the faintest smile. The board chair called a brief recess. Kira stepped into the hallway, the muted buzz of conversations spilling from the room behind her. She knew the Bennetts would use this gap to press their advantage, to remind certain board members of favors owed, to hint at political consequences. She was still in the hallway when she heard a familiar voice. "Miss Holt." Maria was hurrying toward her, clutching a small tablet to her chest. Her braid was frayed, her cheeks flushed from running. "I did not know if I should bring this," she said, her breath uneven. "But you need to see it." Kira took the tablet. The screen lit up with a paused video, grainy but clear enough. They were outside, in the school parking lot. The camera angle was from the passenger seat of a parked car. Troy stood a few feet from Maria, his body blocking her path, his hand gesturing sharply. Even without sound, the posture was unmistakable, confrontational, threatening. Maria tapped the screen. The video played, and the date and timestamp appeared in the corner. It was from 2 days after the lab incident, squarely within the period of his no-contact order. Kira's grip on the tablet tightened. She felt the quiet, deliberate anger settle over her, the same resolve that had carried her through darker moments than this. "This changes everything," she said. The bell rang in the boardroom, calling them back in. Kira glanced once at Maria, then at the door ahead. Whatever the Bennetts thought they had secured in the last half hour was about to be undone. The boardroom air felt heavier when they returned from recess, as though the oxygen had thinned while they were gone. Kira walked in with Maria beside her, the tablet still warm in her hands. She could feel the Bennetts watching her approach, their confidence unshaken. Yet, when the board chair called for any additional evidence, Kira rose. "Yes, I have something new to submit," she said, her voice steady, but carrying through the room. She crossed the floor to where Officer Brooks stood near the district council. "This video was recorded 2 days after the lab incident," Kira continued, placing the tablet in Brooks's hands. "The date and time are visible. You will see that Mr. Bennett approached and threatened a student in violation of the no-contact order issued by this administration." Brooks, meticulous by habit, played the video twice, once to scan the visuals, once to listen to the faint audio. The room was silent, except for the muffled clicks of the playback controls. Maria kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her fingers twisted together so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. When the screen froze on the image of Troy blocking Maria's path, there was no denying the posture. It was aggressive, territorial, and entirely at odds with the narrative the Bennetts had presented. The board chair leaned forward. "Officer Brooks, please add this to the official record." Brooks nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He looked at Kira, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, passing across his face. The Bennett's attorney objected, of course. He claimed the video was incomplete, that it was taken without context, that it was a product of adolescent misunderstanding. But Kira had been in enough rooms like this to know that once an image lodged in the minds of an audience, words alone could not dislodge it. Then something unexpected happened. A hand went up in the audience seating. A tall boy in a Letterman jacket stood. "I have something to say," he told the chair. His voice carried the blunt cadence of someone who had wrestled with the choice to speak at all. "I saw Troy shove Daniel Nguyen into a locker last semester. Hard enough that the kid's shoulder was messed up for a week. Everyone knew not to mess with him, because if you did, you were next." Another hand rose, then another. A girl from the debate team spoke about how Troy had cornered her in the library, taking her notes and tossing them into a trash bin. A younger student described the way Troy's friends would block the stairwell until they were paid in snacks or lunch money to let people pass. One by one they stepped forward, not all at once, but enough to shift the weight in the room. Kira remained still, watching the tide turn with the patience of someone who knew that victory often arrived not in a sudden wave, but in a series of smaller, undeniable surges. Troy's teammates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of the wide receivers leaned toward the coach and whispered something, shaking his head. The coach's jaw tightened. Whatever loyalty had bound them to Troy was loosening, thread by thread. When the chair adjourned for the day, it was with the promise of reconvening once all statements were reviewed. The Bennetts rose without looking at Kira, their steps clipped and fast, as though leaving quickly might undo what had just occurred. Outside the building, the autumn wind had picked up. Kira stood at the steps for a moment, breathing in the cool air, letting the noise of the crowd disperse behind her. Maria came to her side, the tablet now tucked in her backpack. "I want to finish my project," Maria said quietly. Kira turned to her, studying her expression. There was no hesitation there, only resolve. "Then we will," Kira said. "But this time, we will make it stronger." Over the next several days, they met in the STEM lab after hours. The shattered remains of Maria's prototype were gone, replaced by fresh components laid out in careful rows. Kira guided her through rebuilding the framework, reinforcing the joints, calibrating the sensors. They worked in companionable silence most evenings, the hum of tools and the scratch of pencils filling the room. Kira could see Maria's confidence growing with each step. This was no longer about a grade or a competition, it was an act of reclamation. By the time the final piece was in place, Maria's hands were steady. "It is better than before," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It is yours," Kira replied. On the afternoon, they wrapped the last calibration. The door to the lab swung open. Officer Brooks stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Miss Holt," he said, closing the door behind him. "You should know. The Bennetts have been making calls. They are pushing to have the entire disciplinary record wiped from the system before the board reconvenes." Kira set down the tool in her hand. The familiar pressure returned to her chest, not from fear, but from recognition. This was not over. Her eyes met Brooks's. "Then we make sure they cannot," she said. The scene held there. The lab bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. The rebuilt project between them. A fragile thing standing in defiance of those who had tried to destroy it. And somewhere beyond the walls, a storm was already gathering. The district meeting room had been rearranged into a circle, the chairs forming a closed loop without a clear head of the table. That was the point. The facilitator had said, no hierarchy, no podium, no audience. Just the people who had been harmed, and the person who had caused harm, with space in between for truth to travel. Kira sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap, her back straight but not rigid. On her right, Maria's shoulders were drawn inward, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere near the carpet. Across from them, Troy sat with his arms crossed, his jaw set in the same way it had been in the cafeteria that day. Beside him was Kyle, leaning back with the kind of restless energy that dared someone to challenge it. The facilitator, a woman from the district office with calm eyes and a deliberate voice, began by explaining the process. This is a restorative circle. We speak from our own experience. We listen without interruption. The goal is not punishment, but understanding and repair, if repair is possible. She gestured toward Maria. Would you be willing to share what happened and how it has affected you? Maria's voice was quiet at first, so soft Kira had to lean in to catch the words. I was working on my project for the state science fair, she began. It was not just a project for school. It was something I had been building since last summer, piece by piece. I thought if I could win, maybe I could get a scholarship. Her voice wavered slightly, but she did not stop. When you destroyed it, it was not just the project that broke. I missed the submission deadline. I lost my chance. The room was still except for the faint hum of the ceiling vents. Maria's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. It made me feel like my work did not matter. Like I did not matter. For the first time since sitting down, Troy's posture shifted. His arms loosened, falling to his sides. He glanced at Maria, then away again, as though the weight of her words was something he could not meet head-on. The facilitator let the silence stretch for a moment before turning to Troy. Would you like to respond? Troy cleared his throat. I did not think about all that. I was angry about something else, and you were... He stopped, running a hand over his mouth. I did not think it would ruin everything. It was not an apology, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall he had built. Kira noticed it, and so did Kyle. Kyle leaned toward him, his voice low but audible enough to break the spell. You do not have to say anything more. This is just their way of making you admit guilt so they can use it against you. Troy's jaw tightened again. He straightened in his chair, his eyes flicking between Kyle and the floor. The facilitator intervened gently. Kyle, this space is for Troy to speak for himself. Let us give him the room to do that. Kira took her turn then, her voice calm but edged with resolve. Troy, I am here because I believe people can make choices to do better. But you have to decide if you want that. Right now, the The district has enough to take this to the state level. If that happens, it will follow you well beyond school." She let the words hang in the air before continuing. "Here is my offer. You give a public apology to Maria and to the school. You accept the disciplinary action the board has assigned, and in return, I will not recommend the case be escalated to the state." Troy looked at her then, really looked, as though searching for the catch. "And if I do not?" Kira's gaze did not waver. "Then the record will go forward, and it will be out of my hands." For a moment, no one spoke. The clock on the wall ticked in steady beats, marking the space between them. Maria lifted her head, her eyes meeting Troy's across the circle. There was no anger in her expression now, only a quiet, steady weight. The kind of look that asked, without words, "What kind of person do you want to be when this is over?" Troy's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His hands flexed against his knees. Kyle shifted beside him, muttering something under his breath, but Troy did not answer. His eyes stayed locked on Maria. And something in them had changed. The defiance was still there, but now it was tangled with something else. Confusion, conflict, maybe even the first fragile threads of regret. The facilitator glanced around the circle, sensing the moment. "We can take a short break, or we can sit in the quiet for a while." No one moved. Kira held her breath, watching the silent battle play out in Troy's eyes, knowing the next words he chose could alter the course for all of them. And in that suspended moment, before he spoke, the room felt like the narrow space between a held breath and its release. The agreement Troy made in the restorative circle was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a long, uneven climb. On the first morning of his community service, he stood at the edge of the school's courtyard with a trash bag in one hand and a rake in the other. His face was set in a tight scowl, the kind that told the world he was not doing this because he wanted to. Kira watched from the window of the staff room. She did not expect a miracle in a day. She knew from experience that change was never swift. It was carved slowly, like water wearing down stone. But there were moments in those early weeks when she wondered if the stone before her was too solid to ever shift. Twice, Troy lost his temper during those first assignments, once when a group of students passing by snickered at him, and once when the principal corrected him for leaving his work unfinished. Both times, Kira spoke with him afterward, not in the tone of a disciplinarian, but with the steady patience of someone refusing to give up. "You are not here to prove them wrong today," she told him. "You are here to prove yourself right, day after day." The counseling sessions were harder for him. Sitting in a quiet room and answering questions about feelings he had never spoken aloud was like walking barefoot on gravel. There were days he barely spoke at all, shrugging off the counselor's questions. Yet there were also days when a sentence would slip out unguarded, about his father's constant criticism, or the pressure to appear untouchable in front of Kyle and the rest. Spring arrived, and with it, the state science fair. Maria, who had restarted her project from scratch, worked late hours in the STEM lab. Kira sometimes found Troy there too, his hands busy cutting materials or adjusting wiring under her supervision. At first, he offered only mechanical help, saying little, but over time, he began to ask Maria about her design, then about her calculations, and finally, about her dreams for the future. When Maria won first place, the applause in the auditorium seemed to carry something more than celebration. Troy stood to the side of the stage, clapping slowly at first, then with a genuine rhythm that reached his eyes. Outside the circle of their efforts, the fates of others shifted. Kyle dropped out before the year's end, disappearing from the hallways as if a page had been torn from a book. Evan, quieter and less certain, enrolled in a vocational program 2 towns over. Kira hoped it was a step toward a steadier path. By early summer, the school board reinstated Kira fully. On her first day back, she found her classroom filled with a low hum of voices, students arranging chairs, pulling out notebooks, offering her small smiles. It was not the same room as before. The air felt different, weighted not with suspicion but with something closer to trust. The next year passed with its share of challenges. Troy still had days when the old reflexes rose, his voice sharpening in frustration, his posture tightening into defiance. But the intervals between those moments grew longer. The recovery, when it came, was quicker. By the following autumn, he was spending his afternoons in the STEM lab without anyone telling him to. When Kira asked why, he shrugged and said, "Some of the younger kids do not have anyone at home who knows how to help with this stuff." He did not call it mentoring, but that was what it was, explaining circuits, testing code, listening when someone's hands shook from the frustration of not getting it right the first time. On a cold morning in late November, Kira stood in the doorway of the lab and watched him kneel beside a seventh grader whose robot kept stalling. His voice was calm, his instructions patient. The boy grinned when the machine finally moved. Troy glanced up then, catching Kira's eye. There was no bravado in his expression, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if to say, "I am still working on it, but I am not quitting." Kira thought of the circle that had started it all, of Maria's trembling voice, of the silence that had hung between choice and change. She thought of the long months between then and now, of the setbacks, the anger, the small victories that had seemed too fragile to last but had, somehow, held. As the final bell rang that day, students streamed into the hallways, the air filled with the sound of lockers and laughter. Kira stepped into the flow, her pace unhurried. She knew there would always be another conflict, another wound to mend. But she also knew what could happen when patience met persistence, when accountability met the belief that even those who had caused harm could choose a different road. In the end, the power she had sought was never just in the moment she stood her ground or dismantled a false accusation. The truest strength, she realized, was in building a space where someone like Troy could walk back through the door, not as the person he had been, but as the person he was still becoming. The long road was never easy, but it was worth walking again and again, for the chance to see someone take their first step on it. The winter light was fading when Kira stepped out of the school, the last echoes of the day softening into silence. She stood for a moment on the steps, watching the horizon bleed from gold to deep blue, her breath rising in small clouds. Behind her, the STEM lab's windows glowed, and through them she could see Troy still bent over a work table, a younger student beside him. It was a quiet scene, no applause, no headlines, but it carried more weight than any public victory she had ever known. The road from harm to healing had been long and uneven. There were days when progress felt like a fragile thread ready to snap, days when old habits reared their heads, and trust seemed too heavy to lift. But the journey had proven something that often gets lost in the rush for quick justice, that change is not born in a single dramatic moment. It is grown slowly, in hours of work no one sees, in conversations that open doors instead of closing them, in choosing again and again to believe that someone can be more than the worst thing they have done. Kira had learned that strength is not simply the ability to stand your ground when you are under attack. True strength is the choice to keep extending a hand, even when it has been slapped away before. It is in teaching someone to build rather than break, in guiding them to see not just the damage they caused, but the possibilities they still hold. We often think the story ends when the conflict is resolved, when the wrong is exposed, and the scales are balanced. But the truth is, the ending is rarely the end at all. It is only the point where the harder work begins, the work of reshaping a person, a classroom, a community, and that work belongs to all of us. Perhaps you have stood where Kira stood, or where Maria stood, or even where Troy once stood. Perhaps you have seen the way a single moment of courage can ripple outward, touching people you never imagined. If you have, then you know the truth of it. Justice is not a single strike, but the slow, patient act of building something better. I would like to hear your thoughts. Have you witnessed someone change against the odds? Have you been part of a moment where a second chance became the turning point? Share your story below. And if you believe in stories that show the power of courage, resilience, and redemption, Stay with us. There are more journeys to tell, more roads to walk together. Because the long road may be hard, but it is the only one worth taking.